Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Doctors of Running Virtual Roundtable, where we, a group of doctors of physical therapy, discuss the art and science of running and the stuff that we put on our feet. It is episode number 96. It has been, I think, 3 weeks. This is like three weeks I've missed, so I haven't been here in a while. So you guys have been blessed with not having to hear my voice, so I'm sorry that I am back. We also have DJ back for the first time in a while. Matt has been holding down the fort a bit with Andrea, so you've been hearing them. But DJ got engaged since the last time he was on the show, so congratulations. DJ, we're happy for you guys, and congrats.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we like you
Excited.
both. I would say equally as exciting, but it's hard to top engagement type things, but we are very excited for episode number 96 to have
I thought you were going to say the Warriors Championship.
I was going to talk about our guest, but I am pumped that the Warriors won, mainly because the Celtics lost. This is actually like a little...
Yes, I forgot for a half second. I'm sorry, Cory.
Our guest today is Cory Hofmann with one F and two N's. Hofmann with one F and two N's. And he is working for Saucony. He's the performance engineer for them. So he lives out in Boston, which is why this whole tension between David and his Warriors fandom. Cory lives out in Boston, and he's got all of the Celtics things going on. I'm salty because the Celtics took out Milwaukee, the Bucks. So there's a lot going on, and Matt doesn't know who plays for any of those teams. So he's just riding high. The world of bliss.
Not even Steph Curry?
Do you know Steph Curry, Matt?
Is, but yes, good. I do know who Steph
Giannis?
Curry is.
Did you know he played for the Warriors? Okay.
I did not know that, no.
Oh, no.
Sorry.
This is amazing.
I live under a rock.
That's great. You don't live under a rock, though, when it comes to talking about shoes and biomechanics and things. And that's what actually we're here for. So, Cory, thank you so much for joining us on the roundtable. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, really exciting to be here. I love the podcast. I listen to it all the time. So it's an honor and a privilege to be on.
That's so great. We always feel a similar sense of like honor and just kind of like we feel humbled when people like you are listening to what we're talking about. So thanks for listening and thanks for joining us on the show. What we're really going to be talking today is on this topic that a lot of people are interested in. It's the idea of how do we even measure the performance benefit of a super shoot in the laboratory. So that's what he does on a day-to-day basis. That's what we're going to be talking about. And we have a lot of things on our outline. Hopefully we can make it through a lot of it because there's so much to hit. So we're going to dive right in. And probably a good place to start is with some ideas of definitions and kind of understanding of topics. So when we talk about measuring these things, what kind of things do you like to measure? How would you define their units? Why does that matter? That kind of thing, Cory. Or actually, what am I doing? Tell us who you are. Tell us who you are. I was so excited to talk about this, but how did you get to Saucony? What's been your journey?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here, like I mentioned before. My journey is an interesting one. I started, I got my undergrad from TCNJ, so I know you have an alum from TCNJ on your team.
Yep.
I studied biomedical engineering and actually worked on some orthotic exoskeleton designs when I was there. Went on to grad school at Penn State, where
I didn't know you had Penn State too.
No. A lot of competition with you, unfortunately.
Yikes.
The Big Ten rivalry as well.
It's very real. Okay, sorry, keep going.
No, it's all good. So I went to Penn State and got a master's in biomechanics and mechanical engineering. My first job out of grad school, I worked for a company called Cybex International. They make fitness equipment, fitness products. So treadmills, strength machines, basically anything you would see in a fitness facility. From there, I moved on to the world of exoskeletons, which is kind of the opposite of a fitness machine. If you think of it in terms of, an exoskeleton is kind of assisting you in your ability to move, and a piece of fitness equipment is resisting your ability to move. Both for strategic end games. From there, I was fortunate enough to get a position here at Saucony, where I've been for almost a year, where I'm a performance engineer in our research laboratory. So anything from things, relatively, I'll put quote unquote simple, like fit, to things like wear, understanding how durable a shoe might be in the field, but also kind of how we test the shoe mechanically. And then kind of where my focus is, which is performance. It's kind of a catch-all term for understanding the biomechanics and exercise physiology aspects of a shoe and how a shoe influences the stresses as applied to the body.
It's a pretty cool, serpentine journey to running shoe world.
Yeah.
And I think that's the amazing part. I think we've learned over the years of doing this, that as we've talked to people within the industry, ideas that push forward running shoe technology usually don't necessarily come from people who've been in the running shoe world forever. And so having various ideas that you can pull from, I'm sure is super valuable to your team out there. And and we've been able to talk before, and we know how smart you are. So, so thanks for
Don't
coming.
oversell
on.
me.
But now that we actually got to know who you are, let's start talking about kind of what we're going to dive into. Go back to that question about kind of definitions of what types of things are measured and what these different units mean for these measurements.
Yeah, for sure. So, I remember when you guys visited our headquarters out here in Greater Boston. We had a couple of couple of really interesting conversations, and one that you guys all seemed really interested in was how do we quantify the benefit or the performance benefit that a super shoe can afford or provide a runner. It was something I really enjoyed. Yeah, I see Matt grabbing one there. I thought it was a really interesting topic, and it's something that we do regularly in our laboratory. I see another one over there.
For people who are listening, Matt and DJ are doing their typical thing where they just keep pulling running shoes out that are pertinent to the topic. So, anyway,
I should have known better because I only listen to the podcast and I don't watch you guys on video. So I should have known better than saying something that was only available to the video listeners.
No, it's all good.
But yeah, so when it comes down to kind of quantifying how a super shoe kind of benefits the runner, I always like to take a step back and kind of dive in on the fundamentals. So that's maybe a little more boring, but it's kind of the fundamental physics, and it's the kind of the definitions, it's the units, and keeping all of these things in check. Mm-hmm. Because you're going to see a lot of numbers flying around, a lot of terms flying around. Whether you're looking at an article, or something like in a scientific journal. So it's important to kind of hone in on the fundamentals. So I usually like to start with the concept of work. In physics, work, you apply force to displace an object, and that's work. So the units for that would be in SI Newton meters. And it's just when work is performed on your environment, you're displacing something. So you're applying force, but that force is meaningfully transferred to something else. Another way of let's jump from work to power. Power is it's measured in watts, and power is kind of fundamentally the rate at which work is performed. So really, we have work, and then once you consider it's taking place over a duration of time, that's when the metric becomes power. That kind of intuitively makes sense if you think of what are powerful movements, right? That's explosive jumps, short sprints, squat jumps, things like that. Things that require a lot of force over a short period of time. So again, power is measured in watts, so something that can be kind of difficult to imagine or kind of consider is the idea that work and energy, which is another important kind of physical measure, are intrinsically linked together. And energy is really the ability to perform work, and the units are actually exactly the same. So whether you take any of the equations you can think of that you would know for energy, right? Potential energy is mass times gravity times the height of the object above the ground, or kinetic energy, which would be one half mv squared. If you math out all of those units, they all end up being exactly the same. And the unit for that is joules. A joule in energy is exactly 1 Newton meter. Also, interestingly, the biomechanists, of which I know you guys all are, torque is also the exact same unit, so it would be Newton meters. So the context would be a little bit different depending on which one you're talking about, but fundamentally these are all kind of intertwined. And it's all coming down to force, and that force meaningfully displacing something.
And I think it's really good to start there. And it is like you said, it might seem boring, but I think what happens a lot of times is you talked about in articles or scientific journals. The other place you see this is on maybe even on our Instagram post or another sort of Instagram that just throws these terms out there. And I think it's important to know what they actually mean, because you could say something has, does a lot more work or whatever, but if you can't link that to some kind of tangible, meaningful change, which we're going to dive into this more and when these things matter and when they don't maybe, but I think it's important. So Matt, you got something?
Yeah, and I think...
Oh, DJ, sorry, you got something.
Sorry, yeah, and I think too it's also interesting to take a look at it broken up, right? Like Newton meters. Because a Newton is a unit of force, which is a mass times an acceleration. And so you're taking a look at a given weight and how it's moving over a given amount of time in a shorter amount of time, and then now you're adding a distance to it. So it's just really interesting to break that down, take a look at it from a fundamental standpoint, like you're saying, and get down to the nuts and bolts of what is performance, what is energy, what is work, what is torque, and all of these physical parameters that we operate on.
And Matt, did you have something?
I really want to emphasize to the listeners and viewers, I mean, when it's funny that, and Cory, I had to go back to this all the time, that really there's these foundational concepts that you build off of, whether you're doing biomechanics, physics, rehab, human anatomy. And this is what I tell students all the time. You got to know the basics really, really well. One of the things that gets a little bit fuzzy that I think people miss out on, especially when you're talking about forces and things like physics like that, when you're talking about that, when you apply it to the human body, a lot of people haven't heard the word torque before. And that's talking about equating those types of force things, but in a rotational way, because the human body really doesn't move in the way that you typically measure, right? It's, a lot of forces, when you begin physics and some of that stuff, you do it in like single planes of motion, right? So it's, one single direction, but the way the human body works is a lot of the joints are rotational. So most of the forces that are going to get measured are going to be in torque. So you have to take that rotational component into account, which makes things a little bit more complicated. And it's not just as kind of cut and dry and straightforward, so to speak. That pun was totally intended, and I said that for that pun.
Really, Matt?
I love how I had to clarify it this time.
He
like,
only
this
wants
was
to
indeed
talk.
a pun.
Wants to talk only so that he can create puns. That's the only reason Matt speaks on this podcast.
But torque is going to be important to remember, just thinking about that rotational component with the human body.
Let's take this one step further. That's kind of hopefully how we do this. But so you gave a couple important terms: work, power, torque, energy. Let's go a little bit more into power, kind of talk about the difference between what would be the difference between mechanical power, metabolic power, and how do those two things interact, and why is that differentiation important?
Yeah. So it's very important in my mind to kind of keep the two concepts isolated. Mechanical power, if there are any triathletes or cyclists amongst your listeners, they'll certainly be familiar with the concept of wattage. On an exercise machine, you hop on a stationary bike, you'll see wattage pretty frequently. And that wattage is a measure, it's a mechanical measure. It's taken from the device itself. They're looking at some aspect of the resistance. So let's take the example of a stationary cycle, just to keep it simple. We're looking at the resistance, which is a function of the gearing, and the speed. In this case, would be the cadence. So to understand the wattage, it would be, again, it's either force times velocity, or the rate at which work is being performed. But that wattage it's exactly the same. So mechanically speaking, you can quantify wattage actually fairly easily with the right sensors attached to the object, exercise machine or whatever. You can get that, not trivially, but it's fairly straightforward to do. Where the issue comes in is every once in a while, this is back in the day, we would get an email saying, hey, I took the 100 watts that your machine was spitting out that I worked at for an hour, and I went on Google and I typed in conversion 100 watts to kilocalories, and the number was totally crazy, so there's no way that's correct. And it's kind of interesting because, yes, you literally can transfer the units over. Because remember, power is the rate at which work is performed, and work is energy. Really, so power, watts, could also be something like kilocalories per minute, the rate at which you're expending energy. I mentioned before that the units for energy that we typically use are joules. But more often than not, the kilocalories is a unit that most people will be more familiar with, right? It's on the sides of all of our foods and whatnot. It's usually the single number that someone will pull from an exercise machine when they're looking at it. But yeah, so it kind of gives you an idea in terms of, so we have wattage, which came from the machine, but we also have energy that our body must expend in order to produce that 100 watts of output. And the amount of energy converted to watts to get to that 100 watts of output is actually substantially higher, because we're not efficient. We're not perfect machines. We are just a bag of metabolic processes that convert food into some sort of output.
What are humans? Bags of metabolic energy.
Yeah, so we're really just a black box that takes food, breaks it down into a form that can be used by our muscles, such that our muscles can generate linear forces applied a certain distance away from an axis of rotation, which would be our joints, such that we can produce rotational movements or torques. And if those torques are applied to the pedals of a bike, that allows us to produce an output of 100 watts. And the ratio of the metabolic power to the mechanical power is dependent on what you're actually doing. Because every movement you perform, different muscles are contracting, different muscles are working harder or less hard, and ultimately what it boils down to is you have a unique efficiency tied to any individual output or any individual activity that you're performing.
Yeah. Matt, go ahead.
And then and I think that's the challenge, is people just try to convert those units, but it's going to be different for every person because, like you said, there's going to be the efficiency of the movement, the efficiency of the nervous system, how much mass are you carrying, right? Is it muscle mass? Is it fat? How, all these other variables that are going to go into there that are going to influence this number. It's not just a straight conversion.
Right. And you also have individual joints acting as well. So like your foot strike might be a little bit different on both sides, and that's normal. And so you might be increasing your range of motion through the ankle joint on one and then more so on the hip joint on the other. And metabolic doesn't always equal mechanical.
So, Cory, I guess just to make sure I'm understanding a little bit, we'll see if I'm actually present. I just started grad school a few weeks ago again, and so my mental capacity, or my mental reserve or whatever margin beyond the stuff that I'm thinking about, and I switched jobs, so I'm just like, I'm tanked. So we'll see if I'm tracking here. So when you talk about metabolic power, that's the body's ability to produce the energy needed to move something to create a certain amount of mechanical power. So you use this cycle as an example, you're on your bike and it says wattage, and then mechanical power metabolic power is what we had to do within our bodies to create that output. Is that an accurate thing? And those aren't the same number. There's a ratio between them. And if you can improve if you have a lower metabolic power to produce that same mechanical power, that would be improved efficiency of whatever system you're on. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, really well put.
Cool. So I guess you used a cycle as an example, but how does that apply to running? So it's pretty easy to conceptualize that you put energy into a mechanical system that then creates power output. What is that when it comes to running? Because that seems a little bit different when it comes to mechanical power created from metabolic power.
Yeah, it's actually quite a bit more difficult. In fact, there is no machine. So where do you attach the sensors? You can attach them to the human body, but what sensor are you attaching and where are you attaching it? It's actually quite difficult. There are a handful of wearable companies that are attempting to quantify what they call running power. I won't mention any of them specifically, but I'm sure you guys or your listeners might be familiar. But they're all proprietary because there really is no correct way to quantify running power. And they all do it a little bit differently. Some of them have sensors you put on your foot. Some they have a foot and the wrist sensor. But at the end of the day, the aspect of measuring the mechanical power of running is actually quite difficult. So usually when we're trying to determine metabolic cost to the runner, we don't divide it by the mechanical power and determine an efficiency number. Usually what we'll do is we'll just take the same runner in the same set of conditions, right? Same incline, same speed, same environmental setting, and look at how the amount of energy they consume changes, from A to B. And that A to B could be changing the shoe or changing some other aspect of the some sort of experimental treatment, and then quantify that difference.
So it could be as simple as having someone run on flat and having them run uphill. That would be a pretty, you would kind of know what the result would be.
That would be pretty
different.
different.
That would be like one, if you keep everything else the same. But it could be how heavy your clothes are, too. Like if you put on super heavy clothes, that could be another way to switch it up, maybe. But what are there other factors that kind of change people's metabolic cost and metabolic power? I guess, is there a differentiation? You use metabolic cost. Is there a difference between that and power? I guess it's a new term.
Yeah, I probably should have covered that in my definitions, but usually the terms are used interchangeably.
Okay.
So cost, think of cost as just the price you pay to do what you're doing. So in terms of sometimes metabolic cost will just be the energy, whereas metabolic power kind of takes into account the rate of that energy being expended. But it's two different ways of saying basically the same thing.
Cool. In what ways for you in your lab are you going about measuring metabolic cost?
Yeah, so the most, I don't want to say the most common way, but the way that we measure it and the way that many labs measure it is through a process called indirect calorimetry. This is, or more kind of commonly known as a metabolic cart. So this is kind of an apparatus. It can be portable. The one that we have is far less portable, but it's it's not a comfortable test. Let's put it that way. That people have to participate in. But some people also call it a VO2 Max test, which I kind of don't like because you can do a lot more with it than just max people out. So just for everyone's sake, so the V stands for volume, the O2 stands for oxygen, and the max stands for maximum. So usually a VO2 max test could be performed with this metabolic cart. And the experimental setup is essentially you have what's called a kind of one-way breathing mask, which allows you to take in air from your environment, but when you exhale, the air can only go in one direction through a tube, which is a closed system, to kind of a mixing chamber, and then the air that you exhale is analyzed for a couple of different things. One is just the flow rate of that air passing through, and the other is the composition of that air, with the primary two measures of interest being the oxygen and the carbon dioxide. So there's an amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the air already, and then if we look at the amount of carbon dioxide and oxygen in the air that you exhale, subtract them, then you can understand how much CO2 is produced and how much oxygen is consumed by the participant.
Wow. You guys all following this? Everybody's on it? This is
Totally.
Have you guys performed this test before? I
Many
can only
times.
imagine.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. It's
Many,
been a
many
minute.
times.
Yes.
Yeah.
We had some conversations in the lab about this with you. How do you think that's our best mode to measure running or I almost introduced running economy, if that's the same thing, but metabolic cost, is that the best way to measure metabolic cost, or is talking about running economy in conjunction with that a good conversation starter? Just I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. It's everything that you measure in a laboratory is a surrogate, right? It's you're not cutting people open and literally putting strain gauges on muscles and tendons. Everything that we measure is essentially a model of a person. The best model of a cat is another cat, and preferably the same cat. That was an expression that one of my professors told me. Everything that we do is just trying to determine kind of what's going on in the body, and it's a very good one, and it's one that's used widely in the literature. It's a very good measure, but there's always some error associated with it.
Cool. And
and with a lot of these machines too, you have to take some time beforehand to make sure it's all calibrated and the flow rates and everything's all set up nicely so that you reduce that margin of error as well. Because with any scientific experiment, there's always going to be a little bit, so...
Right.
Right.
It's
What's
also
your hot
really
take?
hard to get people to sign up. Yeah, sorry.
Go ahead, Matt.
It's really hard to get people to sign up if you're going to tell them that you're going to cut them open and put strain gauges in their muscles. Subjects don't usually sign up for that. It's hard to get
Not
people
with
to
that
sign up.
attitude.
Not with that.
When I was a grad student, we tested a cadaveric, a non-living foot model, which makes it a lot easier to cut them open and play around with it. Yeah, exactly.
That's why you brought it
I
up.
told you it'd come in handy.
They probably
So at Penn State,
yeah,
we
they
had
probably scream a lot
a
less.
custom. They did.
I'm sorry.
But it was very interesting. So we would load cadaver specimens into this apparatus that would walk the foot across a force plate, at a much slower speed than people would normally walk. But it allowed us to kind of cut these specimens open and put strain gauges on different on the metatarsals and whatnot, and kind of pull on the extrinsic foot muscles a little bit differently to kind of observe how the foot moves and how the foot kind of balances loading while walking. But that's a tangent. Sorry.
For the list,
Definitely gets your foot in the door
no, it's
for
fine.
applied
For the
anatomy.
listeners, that was good. That was good. That was great.
Yeah,
I'm really
yeah.
proud of you for that one. For the listeners who don't know, a lot of the biomechanical literature on some of the internal stuff that goes on is actually done in cadavers, exactly like Cory described. So, when it comes to doing these kind of experiments and when it comes to doing the tests, you also realize you have to figure out how to measure that stuff. And that's actually can be really difficult, right? Trying to figure out how valid or reliable are some of these tests. So it's really not an easy task to set this stuff up, right? It can be very challenging to figure out how exactly we're going to measure this. Is it valid? Is it reliable? And that's what it makes it that much more impressive, because there's a lot of numbers coming at you and you've got a lot of stuff to manage, right, Cory?
Yeah, for sure.
One other question for you on this whole VO2 topic. What's your hot take on people's watches telling you your VO2? Because they're going to tell you. And what are they basing that? I mean, what are they basing that off of? And what should people take from it?
Well, they usually tell you VO2 max, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Normally.
It's a,
Yes, they'll tell you your.
It's a prediction.
I don't even know
Yes.
what mine says. I
Predicted
don't pay
VO2
attention to it.
max.
I say this to everyone who will listen, and I'm going to say it again here. Oxygen is not energy, and energy is not performance. And that's kind of that is a kind of an important progression. So why did I spend so much time talking about power and energy, and then tell you how we measure it in the laboratory is we measure oxygen? Well, there's a step to get from oxygen to energy, and then there's another step to get from energy to performance. To answer your first question on VO2 max, usually what they'll do is they'll look at your performance and then try to backfill into what a VO2 max would be for that performance. What do you do with your VO2 max? So you have it, you write it on a sheet of paper. Let's say it's 100% accurate, and now you have it. Does that make you a better runner? Is that information valid? Does it help you perform better? Does it say, I need to do this workout versus this workout? I don't think so. It's just kind of a neat trick to take to parties and brag about, if yours is really high or not. So I don't know. It's the watches give you this information. I don't know what you do with it.
I think part of my hot take on the whole watch situation is that a watch can basically know your, cadence, stride length. It's kind of getting a little better in some of those metrics, and your heart rate, especially if you're wearing like a chest strap, and they're getting a little bit better at the wrist accuracy. But it can't take into account anything else. Does it take into account how you slept the night before? Does it take into account what you ate the night before? Does it take into account how hot it is outside? A lot of times not. So it's just like this, for me, there's a lot of uselessness within it. And because sometimes I think the predictions, when you go back to your watch, it says, hey, if you want to run in this zone now, this would be a tempo for you now because your VO2 max went up. So now you can run your tempo at this pace because of our predicted VO2. And there's, if someone who works on these watches is probably mad at me because you're like, you're misrepresenting what we're doing. But my hot take is that there's a lot missing. In terms of the data that the watch even has access to be able to spit out useful information. Though, at the same time, I switched over to Coros, and it's been way more accurate than other watches I've used in terms of, like, predicted times for things, but that's
I don't know. Some of those predicted times can be a little...
They're not great. They're definitely off, but they're better. My old
I feel like
watch,
half the times that it says, I'm like, I wish I could run that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, my old watch told me that I could run a sub-3 marathon, and I like died at 3:29:40 or 52 or something. So, yeah, they're not totally accurate, or even close. But anywho, we should probably go back to what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So I think that's you brought up a huge differentiation between oxygen and energy. And is there anything more to kind of go down that train a little bit further that you wanted to hit on?
Yeah, it's extremely important. In fact, it's probably the reason that I think this conversation is really important. And it's the idea that a lot of research, in the literature, a lot of people report oxygen uptake or oxygen consumption during running. And they might have an experimental treatment of different super shoes and quantify the differences in oxygen uptake from shoe A to shoe B to shoe C, or from condition A to condition B. And again, remember, oxygen is not energy, and energy is not performance. So we're getting farther and farther down the line from what we're truly interested in my opinion, which is performance. So the question is, how do we march our way forward?
Yes.
So we have oxygen. How do we get a little bit closer to something that might be of more interest? And the answer to that is in what we've already discussed, and it's in also measuring the carbon dioxide that has been produced. And the ratio of these two quantities is something that we call the respiratory exchange ratio. And this is the primary driver to an equation that's actually pretty good at taking those two numbers and spitting out a reasonable prediction of calories. And more specifically, I should say, energy expenditure, because that could be in calories or any other units that you might desire. But
so in that conversion there, why might one person have a different respiratory exchange ratio at the same amount of I don't know what the right question is here, but like the same amount of speed on a treadmill?
I know what you're asking. Yeah.
So like what are some things that change the same amount of whatever to get the same amount of whatever?
Yeah, it's funny. I totally get exactly what you're asking. The answer is substrate utilization. So it's basically what your body, remember your body is just a bag of chemical processes. It's what food, or more specifically, what macronutrients is your body breaking down to drive these energy systems to convert, to convert energy into a form that's usable for your muscles to create movement. So it's really what you're burning for fuel inside of your body that can influence and alter the amount of energy that you expend, but not necessarily alter the amount of oxygen that you consume.
Wow.
Yeah.
And this was illustrated really nicely There's an article that I'll send you guys, and you can include it in the show notes or whatever. But it's a really nice article. They had 170 some odd runners that they collected over years and years and years, and they did progressive tests where they essentially started a runner, bumped them up 1 kilometer per hour, bumped them up another kilometer per hour while measuring oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production. And then eventually ramp them up to their lactate threshold.
Yep.
Once they hit their lactate threshold, then they're like, all right, great, test is over. Now we're going to look at the previous speeds before you hit that lactate threshold. And what we're going to do is we are going to average over our entire data set the oxygen consumed for all of these individuals, and then also feed both oxygen and carbon dioxide into this predictor equation for energy expenditure. And what they found was across these 4 speeds, so the 4 speeds as you approach lactate threshold, but not at lactate threshold. And what they found was there was not a statistically significant difference in oxygen consumed across these speeds, but there was a statistically significant increase in energy consumed as you approach your lactate threshold. So their final argument is that if you have one metric that in this cohort is independent of speed changes, and you have another metric that is dependent on speed changes, then that latter metric should be the valid measure of running economy. And again, so I'm using the term running economy, I'll introduce that, and that's essentially, think fuel economy in your car.
Yeah.
And it's the amount of fuel you consume or energy to produce a given output.
Wow.
So in the case of a runner, running economy is quite literally how much energy does it take you to do a certain thing. It could be run a mile, it could be run at a certain speed, but when you take into the idea of economy there, think economy is right in the name. It should have energy driving that, in my opinion. And this one article does a really nice job of showing that if you take that extra step and get closer to energy, that's going to be a more valid indicator of a person that's working harder or less hard.
And so if you go ahead, DJ.
No, I find that very interesting about the volume of oxygen and the oxygen uptake not changing statistically, because I was just reading a study the other day taking a look at physiological parameters. And I tell people that physiology is basically just applied biochemistry and taking substrates and all that stuff. And it was like an astronomical percentage. I mean, we're talking like 70-80% of the oxygen that comes in that we don't even use, that we breathe off. And so it makes so much sense. That's not really the main driver of what's going on here. It's other things behind the scenes that are creating this foundation to let you move. So I would love to read that study. So that'd be great.
Yeah, Shaw is the first author. I think it was 2014. I'll send it to you guys. It's a great paper, and it doesn't mean that you can't find statistically significant differences in smaller sample sizes, because you have a greater opportunity for variability, depending on just depending on the cohort of people you select. But this was a very large cohort, and it was all relatively serious runners. And I have to go back to check exactly what that means, but so what that says is, specifically this would apply to running in particular, but that's kind of what we're talking about here. So oxygen is a good measure. It's a good measure to have. Energy, kind of taking that next step, and going from a measure to a prediction of energy based on that measure, I think is a better, is going to be more informative. And the data in the literature seems to support that.
Yeah. Wow. So I think that's really important, especially for maybe people who are going to be trying to read different literature as healthcare professionals, if you're going to be trying to give advice. And so I think looking at what their measurement is probably, that's where that probably comes in terms of most importance. Are people trying to interpret this data for clinical use or marketing use? Maybe that's where the consumer comes in, is you can be marketed anything, and I think you just gotta be wary of that. But okay, for me, meeting you, Cory, and talking with you and Andrea when we were out at the lab, I think it gave me some peace of like, you know what? These people actually care about what they're doing, and they like know what they're doing, and they're not just trying to, make things happen a certain way so that it benefits them the most. Like, that was just encouraging to me. I don't know if you felt the same way, David, or if you just think he's full.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I was just telling my fiance before coming on the podcast, I was like, it's just so awesome when you have a guest that's just passionate about what they do, and it just leaks right out, and like, you immediately came off as genuine and just loving what you do the first time I met you. And I was so stoked for this podcast. You could ask the guys, like, I was like,
it's pretty cool.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe this is another big question. So you mentioned one study. Are there other studies or other research that give us pictures into running cost and across domains, maybe, or specific things to running?
Yeah, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of papers looking at kind of how the amount of energy that one consumes can vary based on tweaking a lot of slightly different parameters of a runner. Interesting. One example is altering the relation between stride rate and stride length, or step rate and step length. And it's interesting because you're thinking, well, this person's running at the exact same speed. They're wearing the same shoes. They're on a level ground, same environmental conditions. But you can cue them, say with a metronome, to intentionally run with a higher or lower cadence, and conversely, the opposite direction for stride length. And what you find is that people are less efficient as you deviate pretty far away from their kind of more or less self-selected cadence. So that's an interesting example right there, where you don't even have to change the runner's speed to potentially alter the metabolic costs associated with running.
Are those short-term, or like acute changes, or have they looked at if someone changes their cadence or step rate over the period of like a month, do they know if that changes long-term as well?
I can't say I know the answer for sure, but I would, my educated opinion would be that your body would adapt to that change over time.
Yeah.
And as you kind of develop those new kind of neural patterns, and you develop maybe slightly different strength and slightly different muscle groups, that the body would become more efficient at that new kind of self-selected cadence. And I'm sure someone's done that, because reducing stride length and increasing cadence is pretty commonly, you guys are all clinicians,
right.
That's pretty commonly reported or suggested as a potential an idea to potentially reduce things like patellofemoral stress or other potential overuse injuries.
Yeah.
So
I think that'd be an interesting thing. I'll have to look up a couple others, because I know the same thing is true for like changing somebody's foot strike, where your metabolic efficiency, or now I feel weird about my terms, making sure I'm using the right ones. But
that was my goal.
Yeah. If you change somebody's foot strike, they're going to become less metabolically efficient, if that's the right word. And I, at least in the short term, again. But I think you might be onto something there, and I'm sure that exists. I gotta go look for it. But I know that when it comes to some cues for changing somebody's running who's been injured, whether if it's like a bone stress injury or something like that, cadence manipulation is one of those we switch. The other reason I think about potential running economy changes, if somebody's an overstrider, striking way out in front of them, you're gonna have a higher braking force, or a force in the back direction from the ground reaction force. So I was wondering if that, if you can land a little bit closer to underneath you, if you can decrease the horizontal force in the posterior direction, if that would long term, and once your body adjusts, if that actually leads to an improvement in running economy or not. Not everyone who increases their cadence decreases the amount of like overstriding they do, but in those cases where they do switch that, I was curious if there was anything on that or not. But maybe questions for another time.
I'd have to do a little. Yeah, I'd have to do a little more digging on that one. Yeah. that's a very interesting question. Yeah, I mean, even something as simple as like strength training,
Right.
strengthening up certain muscles or improving the power output of those muscles by, kind of selectively developing fast twitch capabilities. All these things are going to have an influence on the overall runner and certainly on their metabolic efficiency. So,
Well, outside of the metabolic cart and the stuff that you're measuring there, are there other things before we kind of dive into the whole super shoe discussion and how shoes can change running economy? Are there other things that you pay attention to when you're looking at runners and their running economy? Do you notice trends for longer leg people or certain biomechanical forms, or just any, even if it's not substantiated in the research, just because you're watching a lot of people run, or you can go over the research realm too, but you're watching a lot of people run. Are there things you're seeing that seem interesting or some patterns?
Yeah, it's I think the cop-out answer almost is it's so highly individualized. Every tall person is not necessarily going to have the longest stride lengths of the people that you observe. A lot of them will, some of them won't. Every body is just so unique and distinct that the influence of the super shoe might afford you the ability to increase your stride length or to have a faster turnover or to just have less eccentric contraction of certain muscle groups, and all of those might influence different people in different ways. So, there are certainly some things that I see, but at the end of the day, it's so highly individualized that the error band around whatever average we determine is quite large.
Yeah.
And you see that in the literature. And I think it's why I'm kind of hesitant to commit to a particular number, because for some person it might be 0.5% performance benefit, which is great. It's 0.5%, awesome. For some people it might be beyond 7%, which is kind of mind blowing to think about. But
yeah, that's pretty big.
We've seen that variation in pretty much every study that's been done on a lot of the components, even the super shoes and the stuff together, and the individual components. You're going to have what's called responders and non-responders, and figuring out what each person will respond to is really, really challenging, right? And that's why, Cory, totally understand it's hard to give a specific number, just because there's, as we've talked about, just so many things that vary.
And Cory, when you think about some of the variance between people who respond, people who don't respond, where does that, we've talked about some of those studies on here before, but are there any that stick out to you of significant importance, and kind of what the implications are of those studies?
I mean, if you think back to the original 4% paper, so it's 2018, Dr. Hofmann, he did a couple of really interesting things in that paper, but one in particular was, so he had the most important comparison probably is the 4% prototype shoe at the time that they did the experiment versus an Adidas shoe with Boost foam, and they added kind of lead pellets to the 4% shoe such that the weight would be comparable or identical between the two shoes, because the 4% shoe was lighter, and they wanted to be able to isolate the differences, if any, were measured to the ZoomX foam and the carbon fiber plate. So they wanted to specifically kind of have an apples to apples comparison, because we know that any dead weight added to a shoe will incur a penalty to the runner. So adding extra weight to the shoe, which I have to be very careful about saying that, because for years this study was done maybe back in like 2010. Everyone always say for every 100 grams of weight you add, it's a 1% metabolic penalty, but that's really dead weight. If the weight is added in such a way that so for example, if you take out the carbon fiber plate from a Pro, or Pro 1, Pro 2, or the Pro 3 coming soon, right? If you take that carbon fiber plate out, you will make the shoe lighter, but I don't think you would get the same performance benefit. So it's really a function of adding weight but doing it in a way that you can actually extract benefits from it. But anyway, stepping back to the paper for a second, they added small lead pellets to the 4% shoe and then did their comparison. And at the end of the experiment, they saw a range of from 1 to 7%. With an average of 4%, so the 4% shoe was born. But there's quite a bit of variability around their cohort in terms of the responders. But interestingly, 100% of the subjects did have a performance benefit compared to the boost, and it was just a matter of whether it was relatively small or quite large.
Well, that's pretty cool. I think one of the we want to dig in a little bit to the Endorphin Pro 3 because it's coming, and you happen to know a little bit about that shoe and testing it.
Only a little bit,
maybe a little. So, can we and maybe we can dig into a couple questions surrounding your thoughts about what components of shoes, and maybe specifically with the new shoe and the changes that have been made, contribute to performance and benefit. Actually, just make sure. So, running economy and performance, are we at the same thing there, or have we not quite taken that final step? I always do this. I bring up the next topic and then I go back to a question that I...
Moving on. Okay, we're going back.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and cut. So the final step is can be a very difficult one to make. Going from the so let's say there's a theoretical reduction in energy expenditure of X, for a particular shoe. What will that result in terms of performance?
Do you get 4% faster?
Right, and I think the answer is kind of it depends. And it's unfortunate that it depends, but there are the psychological aspects to race performance that have nothing to do with what you're wearing. There are just so many different factors. How well are you responding to that shoe? One thing that's interesting is we can't test every single speed in a shoe in the laboratory. And part of the reason that is because just there's the practicality to it. We can't test every single person every single speed because they might not be physically capable of doing so. But also once you go once you're beyond your lactic threshold, you're on quote unquote borrowed time, right? So there's only a finite amount of data you can actually capture. And a lot of the experimental techniques that we use really start to fall apart when you start to get into that redlining territory. Now, what Dr. Hucommer's paper did a nice job of was they tested a bunch of different speeds. And they said, well, it looks like the performance benefit is afforded to the runners, at a slower speed, a faster speed, and another faster speed. So we're going to take a leap of faith here that same exact performance would carry over to even faster speeds. But that hasn't been extremely well researched just yet.
Right, which is harder to do because of some of the lactate threshold interference a little bit.
Yeah, it becomes there's the practicality to it, and then there's the validity of the data that you capture.
Yeah.
Both of which make it a much more difficult thing.
So the performance part of the equation becomes very much a human answer, versus there's a lot that you can measure when it comes to energy expenditure, running economy, oxygen uptake. All of those things can be measured. Performance has too many factors that come into play to be able to actually know how much that shoe contributed to a performance in somebody because of all those other pieces.
Which is interesting because performance is literally the easiest thing to measure. You take out a stopwatch and boom,
there you go.
You're done.
Yeah.
So
I was going to say, good science and performance don't always get along.
Yeah. Performance is easy to measure. It's hard to determine where the performance came from. Maybe is the better way to phrase that.
Yeah.
Okay. So you already heard me talk about wanting to talk about this shoe. So Endorphin Pro 3, Cory, we'll let you kind of talk about the changes, in terms of construction that were put into the shoe. I'm assuming I'm making a leap of faith here that you know something about the shoe. So tell us a little
Yeah.
bit about the changes that you made, because this is the biggest change since the original. So tell us about what you all did.
Yeah, so I don't want to go into too much detail, for just because it's not out.
Right.
So I don't want to give away too much here, but so a lot of the research that's been coming out, since the 4%, since the 4% paper and the 4% shoe, et cetera, and the array of super shoes that have followed. A lot of what we're learning is that the foam is just as, if not more important than the fact that there's a plate. And I know I've heard you guys talk about this on the podcast before, but there have been some interesting papers where they'll cut the plate and look and find not a statistically significant difference between the cut plate shoe and the non-cut plate shoe. So there is the foams of today are so monumentally beyond that which of even just a couple years ago, that it's people ask, is it the foam or is it the plate? And I say yes. But what we're learning is that the foam is an extremely important component here. So the short story is more foam, and we've also kind of removed some foam. So if you can hold it up for the video listeners here, but there are kind of some strategic cutouts to reduce some weight. Very minimalistic outsole, because the outsole is rubber. Rubber is very dense, and it's the densest thing on a shoe, so it's going to be a significant contributor to weight. So very minimalistic, relatively thin outsole. More foam, same speed roll technology. I'm starting to sound like marketing here, which I don't want to, but it's we've tested this on a lot of people. Everyone loves it, and I can say almost without exception, we've had this on a lot of different people, and it's compared extremely favorably to some extremely popular shoes already out. So we're really excited about it.
And you say comparatively from your running economy testing with your metabolic cart, correct?
Yes, and also just perception and
as well.
kind of the softer kind of real world data.
Yeah.
But in both cases, we've seen some pretty monstrous numbers. But again, I don't like to commit to numbers because it's committing to numbers. It's so highly specific and so highly individualized. But it's a phenomenal shoe. We're really excited for it, and can't wait to see it out on the roads.
Yeah, we've gotten to run it a bit. We'll go into maybe some of our thoughts in a little bit, but we'll be putting out our full review. It might even be out by the time this launches. Our full review actually might be out.
Can't wait to read it.
So you'll get to hear our thoughts. Cool. But when you think about shoes, you mentioned a couple components of foam, plate. Yes. Can you speak to, and maybe you're not allowed to with the position you're in, but are you able to speak to your thoughts on how the shaping of a plate and the position of a plate and the rigidity of a plate play into running economy, or why you would choose a certain type of stiffness for a certain type of shoe? Because you guys have two different plates that you use in the Speed and the Pro. So can you just maybe some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Again, the answer is going to be it's very highly individualized. We try to provide an option that includes the same extremely high resilience. Resilience, a term just referring to, it's a mechanical property of a material's ability to return energy. So we want to have a couple of different options that can afford a user an opportunity to leverage this extremely high resilience, high compliance also, or softness. So this foam, but provide two different unique underfoot feels, and that's why we kind of have two different options. The Speed and the Pro, that can kind of play nicely with each other in a shoe rotation. The speed, it's a little more democratic, to borrow a term from a colleague of mine, in terms of it has a nylon plate. In which case, so the underfoot feel is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a shoe that can really eat up a lot of miles and might be one that you could take out any day of the week, but really well suited for workouts, tempos, and things like that. Whereas the Pro is the shoe you pull out on race day.
Yeah. Cool. Do you guys have any thoughts you want to share on your experience in the shoe so far in front of Cory? Unfiltered thoughts. Let him have it.
I've been waiting for this version of the Pro for years, and you guys did a great job, right? I've got about 30 miles. This is my left shoe, by the way. Durability's doing great.
How many miles did you say?
I have 30.
That's
still hanging on
for you. There's actually outsole.
That is amazing. Yeah, there is the outsole still there. Definitely can say, like, at least anecdotally, what you were talking about, where it's comparable to other shoes. This is this certain other shoe. This is what I was hoping that shoe would be, but never was for me. So I think it's great. And then I like the fact that there is, again, like you talked about, it's starting to mess with not just what is the foam, but how do we start changing some of the geometry. So this, to me, was a lot more stable than a lot of the other, and I know I'm that person always talks about this, and it's not a stability shoe, but I think, especially with longer distances, having an inherently stable shoe is really, really important over that long mileage, because we're all going to start to break, our mechanics are going to start breaking down at some point. But I think this was a really excellent job in trying to integrate all the things that we've learned over the last several years. And I think, we had Laura, we've talked to Laura Healy, who was part of that study. That was her study with cutting the plate, but still knowing this is like, it's like a recipe, right? And I think I'm going to steal this from Andrea from our last episode who talked about it's like cooking, right? And you kind of learn, you might use similar ingredients, but it's how you use them that's really, really key and creates this totally different thing as it evolves over time. And I think this is a wonderful evolution. You guys have really done a great job, and so I've been enjoying the heck out of this. So, and the speed too.
Yeah, we've seen some monstrous mileage numbers in this shoe. I don't know if you'll be able to run 500 miles in it, seeing how you chew up shoes, but we've seen some pretty impressive numbers. So we know that we're very confident that this shoe will hold up.
Cool.
Yeah,
DJ,
that's
you have
the cool part
any
too.
quick thoughts?
It's been holding up.
Well, Cory got my confession before coming on air, so due to
oh yeah,
at the time,
I shouldn't have put you on the spot.
at the time of this recording, because of our review schedule and who's doing what, I have not had the opportunity to run in the Endorphin Pro 3 yet, which is torturous because this is the shoe that I've been so excited for for like a month. I like literally message them about this constantly, like, when am I going to get a chance to put this on my foot, which will be soon. So I will
it's worth the wait.
Yes,
it'll be fun. I think Matt talked about a couple things. You talked about the changes. So I ran my most recent marathon. I chose to run in the Endorphin Pro 2. And, being in the position we are, we could basically choose whatever shoe we want. But what I really liked about the Endorphin Pro and the Pro 2 and the Pro Plus was, you didn't have as much of an extreme feeling from it. It felt very rhythmic, and it had the it had the Piba foam, and it had all this stuff that went into it, but you could just kind of roll through it. This shoe feels really different, and from what I understand, you talked about the cooking analogy, a lot of the same ingredients in the foam, but the way that it's put together is it has a totally new feel to it, and it's a lot of fun to run in. And I think one of the things that some people, what I loved about the Endorphin Pro 2 is the same reason some people didn't love it as much, was they didn't feel like it had enough pop or bounce to it in comparison to some of these other foams that it sat on the firmer end. This one feels so different. It feels soft and it feels really bouncy. So we'll definitely have our full review out soon, but we had to take the chance to say some stuff about it in front of Cory because that's fun. That's really fun. Do you guys have any other questions for Cory? Cory, do you have anything else that you want to add before we wrap up?
I'll let you guys go first.
I think I'm good. That was great.
I think Cory, my question is really one to help clear up stuff for the listeners, and I think people, and we've been talking about this the whole time, and I think you've mentioned it multiple times, but just in summary, people get really hooked on data and numbers and things like that, and we've been mentioning this repeatedly. What would your word of wisdom, like, again, a little repetition, but what would your word of wisdom be for a lot of the consumers when they're getting hooked on some of these numbers? Or I better ask, like, what would you?
That's a big one.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, performance is the easiest thing to measure. Grab a stopwatch, jump in a race, and you can determine your performance. The best predictor of a race performance is going to be a comparable race distance, maybe slightly longer or slightly shorter. We can get sometimes over infatuated with these things like VO2 Max, but at the end of the day, focus on what matters. In a laboratory setting, there are a lot of different ways where we can measure a lot of different things. But at the end of the day, we start with something simple like measuring oxygen consumption. But there are some more sophisticated techniques that we can make to kind of edge our way a little bit closer to getting a better understanding of performance. And kind of that was the overall kind of thesis of this discussion. And I hope your listeners enjoyed it.
Right. So just to reflect that, it sounds like, yes, some of these numbers are very interesting, but you also have to realize that the best predictor of performance is going to be something that's as close to that thing as possible, which we can't always replicate perfectly in a lab. It's getting better. That is evolving just like everything else, but people also do realize there's also subjective stuff and stuff individual to them. So at the end of the day, make sure you're focusing on learning what works for you rather than just, and the numbers are great, but don't necessarily obsess over those. And remember that it's about you, not the numbers.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, well put.
And Cory, anything else on your end?
No, it's been an absolute blast chatting with you guys. If you ever want to know your potential performance enhancement from any of our shoes, you guys are going to have to make another trip out to our headquarters.
I think we should definitely do that. That'd be a blast.
We definitely need to do that. We had a blast. We really appreciate you having all of us. It was really fun.
Yeah, by the time this comes out, the content will be released. But we got to go into. We haven't talked about this, or unless you and Andrea did last week. Matt, did you guys talk about this?
We mentioned it briefly, but we were too busy geeking out on stuff.
We just had the total privilege of going out there. They sent us the Tempus like a year ago, just to have us get our eyes on it.
The original.
And just to see, hey, do you guys think this is actually a clinically viable option from a PT perspective? And if you do, let's have a conversation about this shoe moving forward. And so we got to go out there, and meet these people, and they just spent the whole day. We just got to geek out on shoes, and it was a real privilege to get to know them. And we talked about shoes 99% of the time, maybe, but we also talked about like marriage advice, and there's just good people, and it's just fun to meet good people. So appreciate you guys and your hospitality and having us out there. And I think working together, there's a different viewpoint from a lab setting, shoe development setting, clinical setting, when we're really looking at injury prevention or recovery from injury. There's little perspectives that I think we all got to glean from each other in that process of the day, and it was just a pleasure to be out there. So we'd love to come again. We'll make it happen. It'd be a lot of fun.
Sounds good.
Maybe not when the Bucks are playing the Celtics, because we were out there during that
Oh
time.
man, you should have seen it.
Although,
Nate had to pull out the phone while we're in transit somewhere. Like
it was the game that we came back and won, like in the last couple seconds of the fourth quarter.
I remember we're in the hotel lobby, and then the guy at the front came and started watching with us.
It was amazing, and he was from Greece, so he was like, "I love Giannis," so it was pretty cool. Even he was probably the one person rooting for the Bucks in Boston. But it was the game when Drew blocked Smart and then picked his pocket to end the game. That was an amazing game. And then it all went downhill from there. It was a really great series. So, well,
I think
go ahead.
Just a last comment. Also, just really want to I can't say any more information. And those who listened to the last episode with Andrea will know that Saucony has some pretty hot stuff cooking. So I think I'm really excited to see what we got to see it. We can't talk about it, but very excited for what you're developing and paying attention. So if you want to have us back and show us what's cooking next, definitely want to come.
Oh my gosh. Great.
You guys are always welcome.
Well, Cory, thanks so much for giving us your time. We record usually on Sunday nights, so we just appreciate it when people give up time in their busy lives and schedules to join us. And I know that I got to learn a lot today, and we hope that this was helpful content for everybody else. If you want to keep following what we're doing, one thing that helps us is leaving a review, which usually takes 20 to 30 seconds on whatever platform you're listening to. But you can see what we're doing in all of our reviews on doctorsofrunning.com. If you have questions that you want us to address, you can email us at doctorsofrunningpodcast@gmail.com. That's the easiest way to get a hold of us. And as always, you can be following us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and everything like that. So we just appreciate everybody, and we will talk to you next time.